Hello, good morning. This is an early morning recording, so probably I should be very fresh. Okay, you have Daniel Guy's book with you, the book on interpreting. It's a very voluminous book, talking mostly about training interpreters for various professions, various professional fields. Okay, so that's a very extensive book. So I'll just be talking to you about some of the basic features of interpreting. Right. So what exactly is interpreting? Interpreting is actually real-time translation. Okay. So what is the difference between real-time translation and conventional translation? Well, real-time translation takes place in real time, as the word indicates, term indicates. Right. So real-time translation has to be immediate. Right. But not all interpreting is so immediate, because you have two types of interpreting. One is simultaneous interpreting, where you interpret as soon as the speaker delivers a sentence, let us say, or a small stretch of speech. This is called simultaneous interpreting. Excuse me. On the other hand, you also have consequent interpreting. Consequent interpreting, where a pretty long stretch of speech is delivered first, and then the interpreter translates the whole stretch. Okay, it might be a paragraph, in writing. It might be a full speech, 3 minutes or 5 minutes speech. It might be a small intervention in parliament. It might be many things. It might be a doctor's advice to his patient online. Okay, an interpreter translates. Now also you also have computer translation for such a thing. Okay, so I think interpreting has been modified by computer translation. You hear people speak, the computer translates it for you. But as I have already, and as Obed also has already reminded you, computer translation has never been able to deliver a perfect output. It's still somewhat sketchy. It's still somewhat vague, inaccurate all the time. So human translators in the form of interpreters are still at work and still in demand. Right. So as you probably know, there is a premium on interpreting. You need good interpreters, good translators who can deliver accurate output. Okay. Otherwise you land up in all kinds of problems. If your interpreting is poor, if your interpreting is not up to the mark, because where it is used as a process of translation, its accuracy is in high demand. So let us say there are two statesmen speaking, prime ministers of two countries, or the heads of two states, the president of China and the prime minister of India. So an interpreter probably translates between Hindi and Chinese, and the interpreter is required to deliver a precise output translation. Otherwise, the international community would be misled as to what actually transpired between these two heads of state. So that is the importance. Or if you are interpreting in a conference, conferences are held all over the world in which multiple languages are used, and computers have been able to do, let us say, a decent job of it, but not yet very accurate. Although the European Union, for example, the consortium of about 27 countries have has developed an almost faultless instant computer translation process for the delegates from 27 countries, I would still say that the output delivered by the computer software in such conferences is far from, let us say, perfect. So even translators are at work in conferences, in courts and police stations. Yeah, this is very important. You can't think of interpreting without thinking of how it figures in courts of law and at various centers involving legal procedures, at police stations, at detention centers, at border outposts, for example, where a straying foreigner is detained by the police and they are interrogated, and you need interpreters for that, right? So sometimes the very verdict in a case will hinge on the correct interpreting that can be offered by an interpreter. A case in an American court involving an immigrant from Germany went against the defendant because he said something like, he was asked if he had stolen a horse, and he said something like, "I stole a horse." I mean, injecting an element of surprise into it. It was not actually a statement, it was an exclamation, which meant something like, "Me steal a horse?" A question. But the interpreter thought that it was an admission of guilt. So he said the defendant is admitted of stealing a horse, and he was convicted for 6 months. This was later on overturned by a higher court, but then the defendant suffered. So this is so important. And the case of the Venezuelan president Chavez, when he was speaking at a conference, the interpreters got it wrong. Not only the interpreters, the press as a whole, because he was reported to have said that people like the late Chomsky will always be remembered for their contributions. So the use of the phrase late Chomsky infuriated people in America, because Chomsky is still alive, non-Chomsky, the linguist. So Chavez was diagnosed as an idiot, a person ignorant of current affairs, the reality, so to speak. But a few days later, a reporter played back Chavez's speech, and it was discovered that he had actually said, people like Chomsky will be remembered long after their death. He didn't talk about late Chomsky. Instead, he talked about Chomsky being remembered long after his death, which is not yet. He's still alive. So such gaffes occur in interpreting, which you have to prevent by doing a near perfect job of interpreting. This is what happens. Okay. Now, what are the basic requirements of an interpreter? What does an interpreter need? Okay, it goes without saying that the interpreter, she needs a thorough knowledge, you can say passive knowledge of the two languages. Okay. By passive knowledge of two languages, you mean the interpreter must be able to understand immediately if anything is said in these two languages. So this is a near perfect passive knowledge of the two languages. Nothing should go over the interpreter's head. When you hear something, you immediately understand it and respond. So this kind of bilingualism, bilinguality, if you want to call it that, ought to be one of the the important qualifications of an interpreter. Okay, and of course, if the interpreter is dealing in a particular discourse, let us say the interpreter is interpreting, translating a paper which is being read out, or the speech of a dignitary on, let us say, magnetic fluids, or economies in the third world. These two topics are fairly well researched, well written on topics. So if anything comes from the speaker which the interpreter is not aware of, the interpreting fails. So you should have generally a fairly extended idea about this domain or this discourse for the translation to be successful. Otherwise, translation falls flat, So this awareness. So this is for an interpreter who is specialized in interpreting in a particular discourse, But that need not be the case. Quite often, you can't have one interpreter for economics, another for history, another for politics. That does not happen. You don't have that many interpreters. But if you are chosen to interpret in a particular context, it must be first diagnosed. It must be first ascertained whether this person has a fairly good idea about the discourse, whether she can navigate in this discourse, right? So that's very important. So one, the overall knowledge, you can call it passive knowledge of two languages. Okay, anything that is said in the language immediately evokes a response from the interpreter. And then, of course, cultural awareness. Cultural awareness closely allied to the awareness about the language. Okay, of course, often these two things merge, become virtually one. So you're talking about cultural awareness in the sense that the cultural nuances of what are being said on the stage or in the podium, in the conference, at the table, are understood as a culturally loaded text. Okay. So if somebody talks about Kallani Kanjivakka in Malayalam, the cultural implications, it's not just an idiom, it might resonate, it might have resonances in the particular culture, So if you are talking about a corrupt official, a corrupt statesman, of course, this is what the signification of the phrase should be well understood. And certain terms which are very loaded in a particular culture. It's not just an idiom. When you talk about things like if you talk about a person's credentials, for example, what kind of a person are you talking about? So you have an expression like Veli Velavatuna. Meaning he's supposed to be the guardian of a people, a gatekeeper. Chaukidar chor hai. You've heard this about a statement in recent times. So Chaukidar and chor, not just the alliteration, the church, but also much more than that. Chaukidar chor hai. So such culturally loaded terms often need to be translated with equally loaded phrases. So this is the work cut out for the interpreter. Okay. Now, this knowledge of the two languages, not only the two languages, their various dialects as well. You know, a statesman or a speaker need not always speak in the standard version of the language. Quite often they use dialects. Okay. So the knowledge of a language presupposes the knowledge of its dialects. So if you don't know the dialects, if you don't know the dialects when you hear, if you can't recognize the dialects when you hear them, this means that you are a poor interpreter. Okay, so a Malayali interpreter ought to know at least when they must be able to recognize the dialects and understand them when they hear them. For example, all the dialects from let us say Parashala to Manjesharam, from the south to the north, or from the north to the south. So they should have this kind of a passive knowledge, a passive, let us say, awareness of the dialects, and enough of knowledge to make out what is being said in these dialects, right? Now, there is another important aspect in interpreting. If the interpreter is not aware of some prior discussions, writings, or speeches on this particular subject the speaker is now delivering his text on, there again the interpreter might do a poor job. So if you're talking about Kerala, for example, if a diplomat, if a prime minister, if a chief minister from another state is in Kerala and is talking about Kerala, the interpreter should know something about Kerala. Not the discourse. The discourse is about high-speed trains, but Kerala, when was it first proposed? Who said what on it? Because the speech might contain allusions to a number of such previous references. So an interpreter is supposed to know something about this topic, something about earlier discourse on this topic, right? So, which means that an interpreter cannot perform on a blank slate. Yeah. So, if you are called to interpret a person's speech, remember that you should definitely know something about what is being said, the topic. If you don't know that, if you don't know what is being said, if you don't know anything about this particular topic, you will be completely at sea. Of course, I said that you should have a general knowledge. Yeah, that's another thing. A general knowledge of your universe of discourse. So a person who is simply specialized in interpreting, that happens. You can be given training. Daniel Gale, the author of this book, proposes training to interpreters. Training in various aspects of interpreting. Like, for example, training in voice production. Voice production is important. Yeah. If you don't have a good voice, although it is not strictly related to translation, voice production is also important. So that is one thing. Then, of course, a training to acquire enough knowledge about a particular discourse. What kind of a knowledge you should gather, what kind of an awareness you should gather, or let us say a proper knowledge about the dialects of the language, one of which the speaker is likely to use, So definitely yes, training has a big role. I will be talking more about that. So the more important thing is to have some, let us say, in-depth idea about the topic that is being discussed. So if you are not aware of the topic that's being discussed, I think an interpreter will be completely at sea, okay, very frustrated, because although the individual word meanings are clear to the interpreter, what is being said, what are the implications of some of the sentences the speaker has just delivered, it completely goes over his head. Right. Now, there is one more thing that one should ideally cultivate as an interpreter. That is some personal, some knowledge about this person, speaker. Okay. What the speaker is specialized in. What a brief bio of the speaker. And also about some work the speaker has done, not just basic details, but let us say what he is specialized in. So if you are interpreting Madhav Gadgil, who placed before us the report on protecting Western Ghats, Gadgil report. So if you are translating a speech of Gadgil's, you should know what Gadgil has done. What are his contributions? What are his major works? What are his points of view? Which is some of the points of view which he has placed before us in his text. So this is what you should know, right? So if you don't know them, naturally your interpreting fails. Okay, you stumble at some point. Okay, you think you're going smoothly, when at some point, when Gadgil talks about, let us say, inhabited areas, what exactly is he talking about? We don't know. By inhabited areas, what exactly does he mean? This goes above your head. That's why I said you should have some idea about what he wrote, his points of view, his opinions on some of the important things which are being discussed. Right. Now, any interpreting, if it is aimed at an audience, not just for recording, even if it is recorded, it's aimed at an audience. An interpreter should have some idea about the audience, because this involves modulating the translation. Okay. So suppose the audience speaks a particular dialect of the language. The translator, the interpreter may be required to translate into this dialect. 1. 2. The kind of audience that can take in the speaker's ideas as such. Okay. If the speech is too technical, the audience may not understand it if it is delivered as technically as it was heard by the interpreter. So the interpreter sometimes kind of softens the translation, making it available for, let us say, laymen. So if Madhav Gadgil is talking about such things like sedimentation of sedimentary rocks, okay, rock layers, limestone quarries, so on, okay, tectonic stability of the Western Ghats, a layman, an ordinary person who listens to him may not understand him if the interpreter uses equally complicated Malayalam terms. Okay, so the interpreter sometimes has to soften it, to say or to explain what he hears. Okay, so this is called over translation. Okay, over translation. Okay, explaining what he has got instead of directly translating. Right. This may be required. This may be required of an interpreter. And let us say, if the speaker is speaking about something which we all know, which the audience know, he might be speaking extensively on it. For example, if the speaker is in Kuttanad in Kerala, he will be talking about the floods, the use of small boats called Kodumbu Vellam, looks like a Kodumbu. A Kodumbu from a coconut palm, which holds those small buds, earlier manifestations of palm, which are called Velichil, and of course the Pukula. So that's why it's called a Kodumbu Vellam. It looks like a Kodumbu, right? So Gadgil is talking extensively on these, let us say, or on the floods, or on what we call Madavizha. Okay, when the water rushes in, the bunds will break. Okay, and the sea and the backwater will become one, which is extremely dangerous for the crops. So suppose the speaker is talking about such things, things which we know well. All the explanations and descriptions can be cut out. Okay, you can simply say Madavizha, which the speaker will be explaining in detail. This is because it's a local phenomenon. Okay, so when the audience knows much about what is being said, you need not repeat it. You need not go to that extent. Instead, you can shorten it. Okay. So this is called under translation. Okay. Or another thing, the interpreter may be required. All these are, I think, common phenomena in translation. It's not new. It's not special to interpreting. So you can rephrase or paraphrase something when required. Okay. So remember, all these are to happen very quickly. You can't think over it. When you are translating a written text, you have ample time to think over it. But here you don't have that. You have to decide immediately whether to over-translate something, whether to under-translate something, whether to paraphrase or rephrase something that's being said. This is a let us say constraint of the interpreter. An interpreter who's required to make her decision immediately, okay, without delay. So a delayed interpretation will not be tolerated by an audience often. They need it immediately. Somebody says something, they need the translation immediately, right? So this is what is happening in interpreting, purely on the basis of the decision taken by the interpreter, right? And you might ask me, so can you have a faithful interpreting? I have already answered your question. No. You can't think of a 100% faithful interpreting. And interpreting always relies on such adaptations, rephrasings as are required. Fidelity is possible. You can't fudge facts. You can't distort statistics. So if the speaker says the Mullaperiyar dam can hold 152 feet of water, okay, you can't interpret it as the Mullaperiyar dam can hold 142 feet of water. So this is important. In interpreting, facts cannot be distorted facts. But on the other hand, to make things easier, as in the case of a speaker discussing floods in Kuttanad, you can simply rephrase it. so that it becomes easier for the audience to understand, or that the audience is simply not bored by extensive details which it already knows, which is very familiar to it, and which looks too unnecessary for any speaker to deliver. So there you can take some liberties, but not when a person talks about the figures relating to something, statistics. You can't. I mean, it doesn't gel for you to distort them or change these facts, right? So I think I've given you a fairly good idea about how interpreting happens from the point of view of translation. Actually, this is a form of translation. You add certain other things, like, for example, a good voice. An interpreter cannot afford to have a bad voice, even if the original speaker has a bad voice. An interpreter has to have an amiable disposition, a smiling face, okay, an appearance that appeals to the audience, if the audience is immediately before you, okay, and of course, presence of mind. Yes, very important. So if the interpreter makes a mistake, he must have the presence of mind to immediately correct it. Okay, alertness. Okay, what is that? When you hear a speech, you must be able to anticipate what is coming. That makes your interpreting very easy. That you can do. Okay. So if you know the person's political affiliation, for example. So if a person speaks about K-Rail, okay, and he is a well-known opponent of the project, okay, you know what is going to come, and vice versa. If you are a supporter of this project and your political inclinations gel with it, you belong to a political formation which supports this project, then the interpreter knows what is coming, right? So alertness, to be on your toes all the time, never relax, okay, always anticipate what is going to come, so that your job becomes easier. And of course, as I said, presence of mind. If you make a mistake, the ability to correct it immediately, right? It doesn't in any way tell upon your professional competence. No, but you must be able to do it. If you make a mistake, correct it. If you are anticipating a message, try to arrive at your interpreted sentence translation even before the speaker has delivered the sentence, key sentence. Okay, so these are some of the ways in which you can look at interpreting as a profession, right? Okay, so as Daniel Geil said, interpreters are trained to become interpreters. There are extensive training programs, not in India but in Europe, in the European Union. So as I said, they are taught everything from voice control, okay, the various ways in which you can tackle messages, even communication theory. You know what kind of communication acts occur. I don't know if they are useful. Like, for example, you describe a particular speech as belonging to one type of communication. Okay, pragmatic communication. Okay, let us say, to exhort the people to do that. You know, good orators do that. So that is classified as one kind of discourse. Okay, as one particular kind of communication. So you have 3 or 4 major types of communication, types of communicators. So a large number of details, right? So as we say about translators, translators are born, but they can also be trained. They can also be trained to become better translators. The same thing holds for interpreters. They are basically talented people who have some kind of an inborn talent for interpreting, but they can also be trained to become good interpreters. Okay, right. So this is about interpreting. I think you have now had a good idea about this form of translation. Thank you.